Okay, so we are going to look at Kennedy and his involvement in Vietnam. We will take a look at Kennedy a couple times in our Cold War unit, and this is the first one. So Kennedy won an election over Richard Nixon and becomes president after Eisenhower. So, a little review of what we know. What was the U.S. attitude towards France's initial effort to reassert its control over Indochina? Explain why and how those attitudes changes. In what sense were the U.S. and France uneasy allies from 1950 to 1954? And explain why the U.S. was reluctant to attend the Geneva Conference. Hopefully you can do that. Take a minute, pause the video, and at the top of your notes for this video, just go ahead and answer one of these questions. Why did Eisenhower get involved? This is something we talked about in class. We did some primary sources on this, but I think it's a good thing to look at. Again, just to review, support the French. Did not want to lose Vietnam. He has been praised for his handling of Vietnam from 1952 to 1954 with the refusal to help the French at Dien Bien Phu, and then the creation of South Vietnam. However, when you flip that around, what did Eisenhower actually do to the United States and for Vietnam? Eisenhower made the U.S. the guarantor of an independent state of South Vietnam and committed themselves to an unpopular leader. And we're going to go over that leader here in a bit, but Dion Diem was a Catholic. He was a known collaborator with the French, and he was not a popular leader in any part of Vietnam. And so when they said they were going to do elections, they knew the United States and Diem knew they were never going to hold those elections when they made that agreement. That's why they never signed the Geneva Agreement, because they knew that wasn't going to happen. Eisenhower focused on the solution to Vietnam to be a military one rather than a social one. Later on, Lyndon B. Johnson will talk about the idea that they needed to win the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese. But Eisenhower, right from the beginning, rejects land reform and other ideas to win the hearts of the South Vietnamese. He rejects plans that might have brought the South Vietnamese in with the United States, in with their own government, and made this something that they were willing to stand up for. Kennedy and the involvement in Vietnam. Kennedy did not want to appear soft on communism. He had a couple mistakes at the beginning of his term. One was the Bay of Pigs, which you could blame on Eisenhower, but they basically planned an invasion to take out Castro in Cuba. The CIA planned it. It was full of leaks. Castro knew they were coming, and the U.S. then they were supposed to have planes that were supporting it. They didn't make it in time, and so the U.S. And the CIA said, "Hey, you need to send in U.S. Fighter jets," which was not part of the original plans, not what he approved, and therefore he did not follow through with that. Because the operation was supposed to have its own air support. They didn't get that. He refused to have the U.S. then enter it, even more so than what the plan was. And so therefore, the Bay of Pigs failed, and a lot of people kind of blame that on Kennedy's reluctance to use U.S. air power. Then you have McCarthyism. What is McCarthyism? Is basically the Red Scare. The people are soft on communism. And because of that culture within the United States, although McCarthy was gone by now, definitely means that the U.S. president has to be tough on communism, and that did not happen. He also had some instances in where Khrushchev was pushing him in several different places, and so within Cuba, with the missile crisis and those things. Advisors: Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Joint Chiefs of Staff: any reversal of U.S. policy could have disastrous effects, not only on our relationship with the South Vietnam, but on our allies as well. And so they began to see this issue in Vietnam as a global one, rather than really looking at why we were there. Why are we going to pour so much money and eventually U.S. lives into a place that was more of an independence movement. And that was never really examined. So for Kennedy, by 1960, the U.S. had spent $11 billion in military aid for Diem. And Kennedy ratcheted up the advisors and the amount of U.S. equipment, more helicopters, everything, but he stayed away from putting in ground troops. 1,000 U.S. military personnel were in Vietnam. Diem and the opposition to him. His style of leadership was dictatorial and brutal, and any kind of opposition to him often found themselves in front of a firing squad. The Hamlet strategy, which was this armored hamlets, bring in the people from the countryside, put them in these well-fortified villages, and let the Viet Cong come and attack them. The problem was that the Viet Cong were in the hamlets because they were farmers by day and fighters by night. And so the South Vietnamese communists were guerrilla fighters, and it was not obvious who they were and where they were and how to fight them. Opposition groups formed and were encouraged by the North. And this is one of those things where how much were they encouraged by the North, or how much were they really the North, came down and then started these groups, and then the South Vietnamese began to become part of it. And then by 1961, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong assassinated 4,000 government officials in South Vietnam. So as South Vietnam is trying to build its government, trying to create a court system, trying to create a government, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese were assassinating all their leaders. And so that brings General Taylor and Rostow to visit Vietnam in 1961 to assess the situation and to advise Kennedy. And here's just a situation that kind of shows where the South Vietnamese forces were. At Ap Boc 2000 ARVN, and this is the South Vietnamese Army, backed by 113 American armored personnel carriers and American-operated helicopters and bombers, refused to attack 350 Viet Cong. The ARVN was corrupt, had infighting, and they were not well trained. And yet, third world failures. Kennedy, we just can't have another defeat in Vietnam compared to his other defeats in Cuba and in these other places where Kennedy was considered soft on communism. Taylor and Rostow basically how to change a losing game and begin to win. Recommended that 8,000 U.S. combat troops be put in Vietnam and give more support to the AVRN. Robert McNamara and Pentagon planners recommended 200,000 U.S. combat troops would be needed to win in Vietnam. Kennedy's approach: increase advisors from 1,000 to 11,000, send more helicopters and more military aid. Notice both of these recommendations call for U.S. combat troops, and yet Kennedy did not put them in. He kept them out and did this more compromised strategy. And that winds up, because of his assassination, leaving Johnson with the decision. Kennedy involvement in Vietnam? Oh, he's a great anti-communist. It's just that he finds the Buddhists are easier to get at. Talking about Diem government and their persecution of the Buddhists. Diem and the Buddhist crisis of 1963. Diem was a Catholic and a staunch Catholic and believed that everyone else that wasn't Catholic was a heretic. Diem allowed the flying of Catholic flags throughout Vietnam, but banned Buddhist ones. And flags were a deep part of the culture that would explain where you're from, who you're about, what it is that you believe. And so the idea of having Catholic flags being flown, but not Buddhist ones, was to get at the very identity of being Buddhist. 10,000 protested. President Kennedy tried to impress upon President Diem the need for major government reforms in Saigon. Diem responded by declaring martial law. His forces raided the pagodas of the Buddhist groups behind the protests. 7 Buddhist monks were killed, and several others burned themselves alive. And here is an example. You might want to turn away if you... That is a Buddhist monk who set himself on fire to protest Diem's government. In 1963, in an attempt to make the South Vietnamese government more sound, he okayed a military takeover from the government. Military leaders had approached Kennedy from South Vietnam and asked him if he would be okay with a coup against Diem, which they then promptly executed Diem, his brother, and their families. So that brings us to, we now have 3 presidents we have covered. Truman from 1945 to 52, $2 billion in military equipment and advice to the French, putting in over just around 100 U.S. Troops, advisors. They were not troops, advisors for the military equipment, and some commitment to stopping communism in Vietnam. Eisenhower reluctantly participated in the Geneva Conference, defied the Geneva Accords, nation building by creating South Vietnam, and wound up having to spend billions of dollars building up this government of Diem. And because he saw it as a military solution, he chose Diem, who was an unpopular leader in the South, and did not do any economic reforms that might have led to winning the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people, but saw it as a military, not an economic solution. CEDAW, Treaty Organization to prevent the spread of communism. And so this was basically Southeast Asia countries coming together to work against the spread of communism. And then Kennedy in 1961 to 63 avoided sending in combat troops, but escalated U.S. commitment by sending nearly 20,000 in advisors, as he upped it to 11,000 and then upped it to 20,000, trying to stay away from having to put U.S. combat troops in Vietnam. Kept U.S. aid and money coming, and gave the go-ahead for a coup to replace Diem. The Avian generals were corrupt and not popular with the Vietnamese, and they then would do coups on each other. And so you wound up with a very unstable Vietnamese government, South Vietnamese government. Okay, we will continue this. All you need is your notes. Go ahead and turn those in, and then we will do some discussion questions in class.